You want to know about the Vols, you go to GoVols247. They'll get you straightened out. Ben McKee, you'll be reading all of his writing there. He joins us now. Ben, things seem to be going fast. I mean, should spring football be over already? It seemed like it happened too fast. Is that just me or is it you too?
No, it's not just you. It feels like it just started and is already ending. But I can't believe basketball season's already over and has been over for like 2 weeks now. So just the world we live in nowadays, and especially over here in Knoxville, what Tony Vitello is doing on the baseball field, it's year-round, truly 24/7.
Yeah, we'll certainly get to some of that talk with the sweep over LSU. But let's start with this. Your spring game offensive and defensive MVPs. Who impressed Ben McKee the most?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'll go position unit for offense. I was very impressed by Tennessee's quarterback room, not just Nico. He looked really good, obviously, but Tennessee is looking for a backup quarterback, and seems like Gaston Moore is going to be that guy. I think ideally you would have liked to have added somebody who was not a former walk-on, if I'm being blunt, but nobody wants to come and play and sit behind Nico, so you're kind of stuck with Gaston Moore. And I really don't mean any disrespect when I say that to Gaston Moore, but it just kind of is the reality of the situation. But the past 2 spring games, he's looked really, really good. And it is a spring game at the end of the day, and we'll see if that could translate to a game. Tennessee was missing quite a bit on both sides of the football, but he looked really good. I thought he looked efficient, thought he had a lot of confidence, thought he had a lot of control of the offense and made some really nice throws. And then the true freshman, Jake Merklinger, gets in there, and I thought he showed a lot of poise for a true freshman. Had a nice scramble on a touchdown, or for a touchdown, I should say. Now, I think it probably would have gotten called back if it were not a scrimmage and the quarterback's not in a no-contact jersey. I thought he probably would have been tackled before he scored the touchdown, but I thought he also showed a lot of confidence and poise and threw the ball well. So that stood out to me. And honorable mention, I think Chris Brazzell at the receiver position looked really good, and Mike Matthews as well. I think those guys are going to be big-time players for Tennessee in the fall.
Hanging out
and
with – sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
I don't mean to cut you off. I forgot you asked about the defensive side. I was very impressed with Jeremiah Thielander, and he may have had as good of a spring as anybody on the defensive side of the ball. When you talk to people behind the scenes, when you talk to the coaches in media settings, publicly, Jeremiah Thielander, the inside linebacker who's now a sophomore, or a rising sophomore, a lot of positive reviews throughout the spring, and I thought you could see that the progression that he made this spring in the spring game on Saturday.
Hanging out with our man Ben McKee at Ben McKee 14, of course, GoVols247.
Well, Ben, I guess who do you think will make a huge jump? Give us your, prediction of basically doing the Pierce Jr. type jump when the season starts. Who you think will have that kind of impact in some form or fashion?
Man, a Pierce Jr. type jump.
Because I think they need that. It could be Nico, too. You never know.
It could. It could certainly be Nico. I do think, I guess it would be fair to call it a jump because Nico hasn't really played yet. Right. But, I do expect Nico to be on that level by the time that his sophomore season ends, just like James Pierce Jr.'s by the time his sophomore season ended. I think they'll be on the same level. But is it fair to call it a jump if that's kind of my expectation for him? I don't know. Man, that's a fascinating question, and it's a hard one to answer because Tennessee's roster it's a lot of veterans. Like you look across the defensive line and you see a lot of veterans, and you don't really expect them to take a jump. You just kind of know what you're getting there. Mm-hmm. And then outside of that, you have a bunch of young guys. I think a good one that's a possibility is Dante Thornton Jr. I don't know that he's going to be James Pierce Jr. at the receiver position by the time the season ends, but I do expect him to take a jump and a pretty sizable jump if he can stay healthy. I just think he's more comfortable out on the perimeter rather than in the slot. Just never felt comfortable there inside, and just could never quite grasp the intricacies of playing the slot position. And I thought he I thought he was playing well when they did move him to outside receiver before he got hurt against Missouri. So I don't know that he's going to take a James Pierce Jr. type of jump, but he's kind of the first name that comes to mind. And I do think he will take a jump. And more than anything, they need him to take a jump. I do think there's a lot of talent in that receiver room. I just got done talking about Chris Brazel and Mike Matthews. Those two guys are going to play a ton, I think, and make some plays. Braylon Staley's the other freshman. He didn't play in the spring game because of a minor injury, but he's one that really turned heads this fall or this spring, and I think he's going to play quite a bit as a true freshman in the fall. But although they have talent at that spot, they still need to go prove themselves, and Dante Thornton kind of falls into that category of one who has a lot of athleticism and somebody who can change the game at a moment's notice because of his speed and athleticism. So I think they need him to take a jump as much as I do think that he will take a jump.
Well, speaking of receivers, do you think they'll, now with some depth that maybe that they trust in, that maybe it'll be a little more rotation? Not sure with Brazel and Thornton and Brew and Matthews. I mean, man, you got a slew of guys on the outside. You think they'll do a little more rotation there at wide receiver?
Man, I'd like to think so, but I'll believe it when I see it.
Mm-hmm.
I just with their offensive philosophy and the up tempo and once if you start a series on offense, you're probably not coming out until the end of that series, just because of how they run things. And I do think you'll see the tempo look much more like what we saw in the first 2 years of Heupel compared to last season. I don't know that there was as much trust in Joe Milton running the offense, just the ins and outs, making sure everybody's lined up, as much as there was trust in Hendon Hooker. And I think that's why you saw the offense slow down this past season. And when I say slow down, I'm talking about Josh Heupel standards slowing down. And it wasn't just Joe. Joe wasn't the only issue. I mean, he was that offense by the end of the year, it was banged up, and the receiver position wasn't what we thought it was going to be. And so I don't mean to put it all on Joe. I just don't think the offense was as dynamic as it was the first two seasons, and you saw it be slower because of that. Whereas with this offense, I think it's going to look much more like the first 2 years in terms of the tempo. And so with the tempo getting back to what we all expect under Josh Heupel, I think it's going to be hard for them to rotate receivers, even if they do have more options that they trust that receiver.
Well, with Big Ben McKee, I guess one more real quick, I guess, where do you see the depth that you need depth, I guess, what position groups, if you still wanted to fill holes? I know you got the TP stuff and all that, but where do you think possibly there could be a depth issue?
Yeah, I'm looking at the offensive line right now, and not just right now. I mean, that's kind of the one that I'm always looking at currently under Josh Heupel, because they just, for whatever reason, we could have an hour-long conversation about it, but they just haven't been able to find and establish depth along the offensive line. They have a nice starting five, in my opinion. I really like what they have in their starting lineup, even if they do still have questions at left guard. But outside of those 4 to 5 starters, I mean, you don't really know what you have behind them. You certainly have a lot of inexperience and a lot of question marks behind that starting offensive line. So they need to continue to develop their youngsters. I do like the freshman offensive line class that they just brought in. I think it does have a ton of potential, but not really realistic to expect them to play at the level you need them to play at in order to win as a true freshman in this conference at that position. So I worry about the offensive line depth. We saw it last year when a Cooper Mays or Javonte Spraggins got hurt, or even John Campbell and Gerald Mincy when they were banged up and they were searching for a third and fourth offensive tackle. They just haven't really had one, and I don't know that they have one this year either, even with landing Lance Hurd out of the portal from LSU. So I worry about their depth up front along the offensive line, and then with running back as well. Cam Seldon expected to be the backup, but he's dealing with a shoulder injury that may force him to miss some time early in fall practice, which puts him behind the 8 ball going into the season. And outside of that, you have Deshaun Bishop and Khalifa Keith, who had nice springs, but they just lack experience. And Peyton Lewis, the freshman that they really like, he was banged up this spring. So you really have Dylan Sampson and a bunch of inexperience. So I worry about the depth behind Dylan Sampson because of that as well.
There you have it. Go Vols 247, Ben McKee.
Ben, how do you balance the excitement of seeing explosive plays return with the anxiety of seeing explosive plays given up?
Yeah, that's a great question because we've already talked about the receivers looking good on Saturday. That means they were burning defensive backs, which I know Blaine loves hearing that.
Yeah, I wouldn't too happy about that.
Yeah, I bet. Not the best day. I do think it was consistently maybe one guy or two guys here and there that were consistently being beaten instead of the whole group, if that makes sense. Although there were some coverage busts there. But you look at Jermon McCoy, the Oregon State transfer, who had a nice spring at corner, and then Ricky Gibson III, who appears to be set to step into a starting spot as a sophomore. Those two guys looked pretty good and again, had pretty strong springs. So I think you feel good about that. You do have more athleticism at safety now, I feel like, with Jacoby Thomas coming in from MTSU. But you still have some questions at star, at that nickel spot with Boo Carter, who looks phenomenal, but he is a true freshman at the end of the day. Although he may be different than your average true freshman, and you have a lot of confidence in him. He's been one that kind of he stands out when you watch Tennessee practice and when you watch Tennessee play. He just looks a little different in his pads and moves around a little different. You can tell he's got an it factor to him. So they're still trying to figure some things out in the secondary, but there were a couple of guys who certainly need to have a strong summer and have a bounce back performance from the spring game. And not that the spring game is the end all be all, right? It's essentially one practice of I guess 12 to 15 or so. And so just because they performed poor in the spring game, that doesn't mean that they had a poor overall spring. But it was not pleasant to the eye if you're a Tennessee fan to see the defensive backs leave so many receivers open when that's been a problem the last couple of years. So I don't know as much. It was as much of a group issue as it was an individual issue with some guys, but certainly something that needs to get ironed out moving forward.
What was the guest list like across the sports on Saturday? Seems like there were quite a few nice recruits in town.
Yes, there were a ton of recruits, and Ryan Callahan, our recruiting guy at GoVols247, he has a ton of updates up at our site right now that I encourage people to go check out. The big one, obviously, was David Sanders Jr., the five-star offensive lineman from the Charlotte area. Back-to-back weekends he was in town. He was in town the previous weekend as well for a big recruiting day on a Saturday in which Tennessee was practicing, and a lot of the recruits in town were able to go over to Josh Heupel's house and watch the Final Four that night after watching practice and spending time on campus during the day. So we just talked about Tennessee needing more offensive linemen. They need more depth. They also need more talent. And again, not that the offensive line has been bad, but in order to go win a championship, your offensive line has to be elite and or at least has to be really good. I mean, the offensive line to me was the difference in Tennessee winning 10 games 2 years ago and winning 8 games in the regular season last year. So they need to take a step forward with their offensive line recruiting, and I feel like they're doing that. And it kind of starts with David Sanders Jr. right now. He's the big fish that Tennessee's trying to reel in, and really steep competition with Clemson. But I feel like David Sanders Jr., he and Tennessee are clicking pretty well right now, and Tennessee's in a good spot for him. Not to insinuate that that's a done deal or anything, but big to have him on campus for 2 consecutive weekends as you're trying to wrap that up going into the official visits in June. And you had some other big-time offensive linemen as well, big-time receivers. And like I said, Ryan Callahan has a lot of updates up at the site at GoVols247 on those guys.
For sure, always. Ben McKee writing about it all, too, at GoVols247 at Ben McKee14. Follow him there on Twitter.
Big Ben, I guess now that spring ball's over, are there any, post-spring TPers, transfer portals potentially, maybe not naming names, but, potentially that then opens up the gate to bring in other players as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's certainly a couple of guys who may not be as high on the depth chart as they would like to be that will will probably look around. Younger guys, it seems like if you don't make a move on the depth chart within your first 2 years or going into your second year, then in today's world, it's time to bounce. At least that's what these guys seem to think nowadays. And so I'm sure you'll see a couple of young guys or two who haven't really made a move on the depth chart the way that they thought they would when they signed. I'm sure you'll see a guy or two leave in that regard. And that does open up a spot, although Tennessee is working on a numbers crunch because of the whole fallout with the Jeremy Pruitt investigation. So they kind of have to be smart with who they take and how many they take. But they're certainly looking for help and keeping their eyes on the portal. Talked about the offensive line and running back room. I don't know that it's a guarantee that Tennessee absolutely adds at those positions of need. I don't think they're going to add a body just for the sake of adding a body. But if it's a body of quality that they think can help win games, obviously, then I do think that they're going to pursue that player. So I expect them to be pretty active. But in terms of a big fish leaving Tennessee or entering the transfer portal, I would be very surprised if that happened.
No doubt about it. We're with Ben McKee. I guess I wanted to ask who was, or who had a disappointing spring overall, whether it was not just a game. I'm talking about in totality. When you go out there and watch every day, you go, we're not looking too good today. We're not looking too good again today. Oh, dang. Oh, he looked kind of good today. Any of those guys like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple that you kind of wonder if, speaking of making moves on the depth chart, you wonder if they're going to be able to. And I look at a guy like Nathan Laycock, and he was a big-time signee at the receiver position, and I don't know that he had a bad spring in terms of his performance, but it was bad or unfortunate for him because he couldn't stay out on the practice field. And as I'm sure you've heard a ton, and as Jason Swain reminds me all the time, you can't make the club in the tub. Yep. And Nathan Laycock is somebody who has not been able to stay healthy. He just can. And going into his sophomore season, I wonder if he's a guy that looks to make a move, or if he's okay with sticking it out and trying to battle through some of this early adversity that's been thrown his way early in his career. But we talk about the receivers and how good some of those young guys look, like a Mike Matthews or Braylon Staley, and it's not a good thing for Nathan if he's on the sideline watching because he's banged up and these other youngsters are making moves. So when he was out there, I don't know that I would classify it as poor performance. It's just unfortunate luck at minimum for him that he wasn't able to stay healthy and kind of be out there. And there's some defensive backs as well, like a Jordan Matthews, that I'm surprised that he's not further along in his development. I mean, that's a kid from LSU's backyard that picked Tennessee over LSU and Texas, and he hasn't really made a move yet on the depth chart. Ricky Gibson has. Christian Conyer, he had a nice spring at that corner position, I thought. Jemima McCoy comes in, and Jordan Matthews was a guy that was expected to play kind of right away as a true freshman, and it just hasn't clicked yet for him. So he's another one that when you ask that question, one of the first names that pops in my mind that isn't as far along as I expected them to be at this point.
How much when you're looking for depth as coaches, I don't know if Heupel and staff have mentioned it, but if you're looking for a depth piece, whether I'm just using an example, quarterback or even running back, how much does NIL come into play with guys who are depth pieces and you put them on scholarship? Does that factor in at all?
Well, I think it does, just because everybody that enters the portal thinks that they can make more money than they probably deserve. Everybody is asking for a number, and sometimes, and probably more often than not, that number is not realistic. So I do think that it plays a role for sure, and that's where it's up to Tennessee to decide whether they feel, okay, this running back, do we feel that it could be 1A, 1B with Dylan Sampson? Do we feel like it could at least be RB2? Because, I mean, there's been running backs that have come in through the portal. I'm thinking of one specifically under Jeremy Pruitt that was not worth taking in hindsight, and a quarterback as well. But you just kind of take a body just for the sake of taking a body, and I don't think that's very smart. I think you're just wasting a scholarship at that point. If you're going to bring in somebody, it's got to be somebody that can help you win football games and can play and be a positive on the field, and not somebody that's just in shoulder pads that you're handing the ball off to and hoping that he can get back to the line of scrimmage. So I think the money absolutely plays a role because guys typically view themselves as more than what they actually are. And what you hope for, I think, is you just hope that those players have good people in their lives that can kind of bring them back down to earth or help them see the bigger picture, that it's not about necessarily cashing in a check or a bag right now. It's about proving yourself at this level so you can get an even bigger bag at the next level. And I think that's the mindset that you're hoping to look for. But it certainly plays a role, because nowadays NIL it seems like it's part of every conversation that's had on the recruiting trail. With some guys, it's more than others, but it's at least mentioned or thought of in the back of your head, I think.
That's it.
Ben, fantastic stuff as always, man. We know you're busy covering everything. A big baseball series coming up with Kentucky this week, number 4 versus number 3 in Lexington. That's going to be fun. All the details will be at GoVols247. We know it. Thank you, sir, for the time today.
Yeah, appreciate y'all having me on as always, and hope y'all have a great week.
Yes, sir. The one and only Ben McKee at Ben McKee 14. Follow him there. Coming up next,